In the winter of 1991, a woman named Claire Treadwell moved into a small weathered cottage in Shropshire, England. The house, which sat just on the outskirts of town, had a view of the vast countryside with thick woods hugging the horizon. It was charming in a storybook way, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and an ancient oak tree shading the front yard. Claire had moved there to escape the bustle of London, hoping to find peace and solitude. It didn't take long for strange things to begin. The first night was cold, and as she was unpacking her things, Claire heard something she hadn't expected in such a quiet place. A slow, rhythmic knocking at the front door. She paused, her heart skipping. No one should have known she'd moved in, and it was well past midnight. She went to the door, looked through the peephole, but saw only darkness. The next day she mentioned it to a local shopkeeper in town who gave her a puzzled look. He joked that it might be the black-eyed man, a local legend about a figure who's roamed the area's old farmhouses at night. Claire laughed it off, but the shopkeeper's face remained serious. Some say he was a poacher who lived out here long ago, he told her. Other people say he's much older than that, one of the spirits tied to these woods. The story goes on, he appears outside homes when something's about to go wrong. People say you'll know him by his eyes. Black, empty, like pits. Shaking off the eerie tale, Claire went home, dismissing it as local superstition. But as the days passed, she began to feel less comfortable in her own home. It started with small, strange things. The creak of the floorboards late at night, a cold draught passing through her bedroom, even when the windows were tightly shut. Then, about a week after she moved in, she noticed that her belongings had been moved. Her coat, which she always hung on a peg by the door, would end up on the floor or across the room. Books she left on her bedside table would end up stacked by the window. Each time she would put things back in their place, wondering if perhaps she was simply forgetting where she'd left them. But it wasn't until the second week that she truly began to feel afraid. One night she was woken around 3 a.m. by a loud banging. It was coming from outside near the back of the house. She got up, her heart pounding, and moved cautiously toward the back door. She could hear something heavy dragging across the porch, like the slow pull of boots scraping against wood. Taking a deep breath, she peered out through the narrow back window, but there was nothing there, only the dark expanse of the woods. She barely slept that night, and the next day she was exhausted, tense, and on edge. She felt like someone was watching her. Though every time she looked outside, the yard was empty, the roads still. The following evening, just after sunset, she noticed something standing by the edge of her yard. At first she thought it was a tree, a dark shape near the fence, but as she looked closer, the shape began to resemble a man, standing completely still. His face was turned toward her, though she couldn't make out his features. She watched him for several minutes, waiting for him to move, to confirm he was really there. Finally she called out, "Hello? Can I help you?" The figure didn't answer, didn't move. Claire shut the curtains, her hands trembling. When she finally summoned the courage to peek again, he was gone. But her fear hit its peak 2 nights later, when she woke up just after midnight to find her bedroom shrouded in an intense, oppressive cold. Her breath was visible in the air, a strange sight in an otherwise warm room. She lay frozen in bed, listening to the silence, but after a moment a familiar sound broke it, the slow, deliberate knock from her first night. It was coming from her bedroom door. Her heart hammered. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was paralyzed with fear. She pulled her blanket up, waiting for it to stop, praying that it would. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, each knock slow and deliberate. Finally it stopped. After a tense, silent moment, she took a breath, thinking it was over. But then she heard something that terrified her even more, the sound of footsteps approaching her bed. She held her breath as the footsteps stopped just beside her bed, and then, in the dim light of the moon filtering through her curtains, she saw him, a tall, gaunt man standing beside her, his head slightly tilted as he looked down at her. His eyes were dark, hollow, completely black, as if his eye sockets were empty voids. Claire tried to scream, but nothing came out. She could only stare, paralyzed as he watched her, silent and still. After what felt like hours, he finally turned and drifted slowly out of the room, disappearing into the hallway. The next morning, Claire packed her things and left without a second glance, leaving the keys on the table and vowing never to return. After she moved away, she tried to explain what she'd seen to friends and family, but most thought she'd simply had a nightmare, that the stress of moving had triggered a sleep paralysis episode. She wanted to believe that too, but months later, she met an older woman who had lived in Shropshire for decades. When Claire mentioned the house, the woman's face grew solemn. "You were at the Treadwell cottage?" the woman asked, lowering her voice. "That place has been empty for years. People say it's haunted by the black-eyed man. No one knows who he was or what he wants. Only that he appears at the bedside of those he chooses to visit, and when he does, it's a warning." Claire never returned to Shropshire, and the cottage has remained vacant ever since. Local children avoid the road where it stands, convinced that if you walk by it late at night, you can still see the black-eyed man standing at the window, watching, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of going inside.